Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth. Today my guest is an author who has a book that came out a couple years back called Court Martial. He's got another book coming out this summer called The U.S. Naval Institute on Military Justice. He's written for publications such as Salon, Washington Post, and Reason. He holds a Ph.D. in American history. I am speaking with Chris Bray. How are you, Chris?
Good. How are you?
Excellent. So talk to us. How did you end up in this subject matter? How did you end up in the military? How did you come up getting into today's topics?
I ended up in the military first. I ended up in the military because it was something that interested me as a writer. I was a newspaper journalist back when newspapers still sort of existed and mattered, which they haven't for probably a decade. But I was writing about the military, and I wanted to understand it more, so I enlisted. I joined the Army and was an infantryman for a couple of years, and then got out, and then thought I was done and was ordered back to active duty from the Individual Ready Reserve and went to Kuwait for a while. So I have a few years of military experience and sort of experience with military culture. And then I was working on my dissertation. I was in grad school after I was all done with the Army, and I was working on a totally different topic. And I wandered into an archive in Massachusetts that had a bunch of state court-martial records from the late 18th and early 19th century that no one had ever touched. I pulled them out of the box, and I realized I was the first person who'd looked at them in 200 years. And they were just incredible. They were incredible material. And I realized that there was this trove of stories that no one had touched that I wanted to open up.
Wow. And so did any of your time in Kuwait kind of influence that at all? Or was Kuwait largely uneventful? Or did you see things in Kuwait that made you think about this subject a little bit?
Kuwait was as uneventful as it's possible for military service to be. In Kuwait, I worked, I was an operations sergeant in an infantry battalion that our job was to secure American military facilities in northern Kuwait, so that if we were attacked in northern Kuwait, we would respond to the attack, and we were never attacked in the year that I was there. So I spent that year watching television and the talk and sighing heavily, gaining weight, and the DFAC. The thing I wrote about being in Kuwait was that, the DFAC, the dining facility,
right,
when I got there, had an ice cream bar and a separate freezer full of ice cream. And then after I was there about 6 months, they wheeled in a soft-serve ice cream machine. So my experience of Kuwait was television and ice cream. And it was like they thought we never had enough. The new televisions kept appearing all over I was at Camp Bearing, Kuwait. So I did absolutely nothing for a year.
Wow. And that should be your book title next time is Televisions and Ice Cream.
Someone wanted a lieutenant I knew who was in the battalion that did security for American military facilities in southern Kuwait, wanted to write a book about his experience, and his title for it was, his proposed title for it was In the Rear. And I think, I think we're all lessened as human beings by the fact that book was never published.
Yeah, and not to devolve into dick jokes, basically, but I remember when the Arab Spring was happening and Tahrir Square was kind of the big news item at the time. And I was watching TV, and I'd fallen asleep, and some late night show was on, and this comedian was making jokes about the Arab Spring, and he said, "Yeah," he goes, "I took a date to Egypt, and she took it to Tahrir." And so that's as low as it gets. So in your studies, obviously, you wrote the book Court Martial. You got into the military courts. You got into that history. And, we talked a little bit before. I know you're talking a bit about flogging and dueling, and I want to get into that as well. But did you see like a two-tiered system in the military justice system?
There has been, and there's not anymore. There's a different problem. There's a different task for military justice than for civilian justice. Let me tell you a story that I think illustrates it. I'll tell you about Donald Downard. I think this is a great introduction to military justice. Donald Downard was a lieutenant colonel during World War II, and he stayed in the Army after the war. 1951, he was at an officers' club at Fort Monroe, Virginia, and he got in an argument with his wife, who was one of many wives he had during the period, which was part of the controversy. he got in this argument with his wife at the officers' club in front of other officers, and he started screaming at her and abusing her, hit her, pushed her around. She tried to get in the car, or he tried to put her in the car to drive her away, and she wouldn't get in, and he was hitting her on the arms to break her grip on the car. In front of, hundreds of other officers watching this happen. And later that night, the MPs found his wife wandering around the post, bruised up, with her clothes torn, shoeless. He had beaten her up, and so he was court-martialed for conduct on becoming an officer, and they had no trouble finding him guilty. There was no question he'd done it. But then at his trial, a bunch of senior officers, general officers, and other colonels showed up and testified about the Donald Downard that they knew during World War II. During World War II, Donald Downard was injured in combat 5 times. And he kept going back and fighting. They would patch up his wounds at the aid station, and he'd go right back into combat. He won the Silver Star. He won he was awarded the Purple Heart 5 times. And everyone who testified about his combat experience in World War II said he was the bravest man they'd ever known. They said he was the most brilliant combat leader they'd ever known. They said they'd never seen a finer officer in a combat setting. You can Google Donald Downard Dachau, and you can see what he did in the war. As American troops approached Dachau, they found a train car full of dead bodies, emaciated dead bodies outside of Dachau. And as they opened the cars up and stood looking into the cars, they heard moaning from inside of one of the cars, and they realized someone was still alive under a pile of bodies, and nobody else wanted to deal with it. Nobody else wanted to go into the car. And when Donald Downard heard, he ran up, jumped in, and started throwing dead bodies aside until he found the person who was still alive, put him over his shoulder, and took off running. Took off running for the aid station, right? He was the person who, in a situation of extreme danger, in a situation of horror, in moments when other men were terrified or they were disgusted, they were repulsed, he was the guy who said, okay, let's just do this. Let's just deal with whatever needs to be done. So the court said, you've lied to your chain of command about your many wives, right? He would get married and then he would start living with another woman on post and tell the Army, oh yeah, she's my new wife. But he was still married to someone else.
Okay.
And he hadn't married that woman yet, so he lied to his chain of command. He beat up at least one wife. His life was a disaster. And they said, obviously you're guilty of the crime of conduct on becoming an officer. Now, in Donald Downard's defense, if we look back at what he did and when he did it, he had been through 4 years of relentless, brutal combat. He was injured 4 times, and it was a period when people didn't understand PTSD and what that does to you.
Right.
So probably what was happening to Donald Downard is that he was fucked up beyond belief.
Absolutely.
And he wasn't beating up his wives because he was born a bad man. In fact, later in life, he married and was married for many decades to the woman who was his wife when he died. Probably what happened to him is that he had combat trauma that hadn't been treated. But they looked at him, the court looked at him, and they said, obviously you're guilty of this crime. And under the law, there's only one sentence available to us. We have to sentence you to being stripped of your commission. You can't be an officer anymore. You can't be in the Army anymore. But they recommended to the convening authority, to the general who convened the court-martial, that they disapprove the verdict they gave. They said, we had to convict this man. We had to sentence him to removal from the Army. Don't remove him from the Army. We need him. We need leaders like this. So the problem in military justice is that the military exists as an organization that is designed to be lethal. It is designed to deliver organized violence.
Sure.
And it's not invariably true that men who are good at delivering organized violence, who are good at leading people and killing the nation's enemies, are good people in every aspect of their lives, who have full control over every aspect of their lives, who never have problems with anger, especially if they've experienced extensive combat. There are competing values, there are competing things going on that would never show up in a civilian courtroom. So the military justice system has to preserve the lethality and the violence of the military while trying to police other values. And it's not a dilemma that civilian military justice systems face.
Well, let me ask you a really quick question. So, what year was? Obviously, he was in World War II. What year was his trial? What year did this occur?
1951. And 1951 is an interesting moment because he beat up his wife while the Articles of War were in effect. The Articles of War had been the nation's military law for almost 2 centuries. And it was the exact moment when the Articles of War had been thrown out and were being replaced by the military law we have now, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which we should talk about later on. But nobody knew exactly which law to try him under. One was in effect when the offense occurred, and the other was in effect when his trial began and when he was sentenced. So it was actually the thing that allowed him to stay in the military. The convening authority approved the verdict and sentence, and then he appealed, which he was newly able to do because the UCMJ created a new appeals court for the military. And the confusion over which law was supposed to prevail caused the Court of Military Appeals to throw out his conviction. So he stayed in the Army.
Okay, so as a for instance, and I know you said you want to talk about this later, so we'll go into more detail later, but just because it's occurring to me right now, is the Uniform Code of Military Justice, is that why the My Lai massacre issue was handled, say, differently than this issue with Donald Downard?
No, not really. Although to sort of sketch the differences between the two, the Articles of War, under the Articles of War, if a soldier was accused, have you heard the term drumhead court-martial?
Yes.
So a drumhead court-martial is a court-martial in the field. I'll give you an example. During World War I, there were 2 soldiers who fell asleep on guard duty, and they fell asleep at very critical points in the front lines, such that the Germans could have, if they'd found those unguarded positions, could have broken through the line, gotten into the American rear, and killed lots of people. So it's tremendously serious that these soldiers fell asleep in their positions. And the Army had drumhead court-martials. They had instant, immediate court-martials in the field, a few hundred yards behind the front lines, an infantry lieutenant, because at the time, under the Articles of War, soldiers weren't legally entitled to legal representation. An infantry lieutenant was appointed to be their defense representative. And the court-martials for both of these soldiers took a few minutes. And the infantry lieutenant, who had no legal training, who was appointed to represent them, said, "Look, you did fall asleep, and I don't really know any law, so why don't you just plead guilty, admit that you did it, and we'll ask the court for mercy." And the court, in a few minutes, took the guilty pleas and sentenced both men to death.
Wow.
There was no Court of Military Appeals. There was no appeals process except to ask the convening authority to disapprove the sentence and the verdict. And so over and over again, for the first more than 150 years of American military justice, if you were accused of something, you could be tried in a few minutes. You could be tried an hour after your offense. You could be tried without a defense representative, sentenced, and the sentence could be carried out in a few minutes. During the War of 1812, famously, Andrew Jackson had a bunch of Tennessee militiamen serving under federal authority in his army as he fought the Creeks. The Creek War and the War of 1812 against the British took place at the same time. So Andrew Jackson was fighting Creeks, and a group of Tennessee militiamen felt like it was time for them to leave, like they'd done enough service, and they left. And he ordered their ringleaders, their 6 ringleaders, tried for desertion. They were found guilty and shot in a matter of days.
Wow.
Over and over and over again, you see people being tried, sentenced, convicted, shot. And that's kind of the military standard for most of history.
Right.
Over the course of the 20th century, there were a series of legal changes, starting in the Articles of War. The Articles of War were revised after World War I. But then after World War II, particularly because there were tens of thousands of court-martials that took place during World War II that were thrown out after the war by review panels that the armed forces appointed to look at. There were 1.8 million court-martials, American court-martials during World War II, and tens of thousands of them were found to have been unfair, and the sentences were thrown out after the war. So Americans revised their military law, they created a whole new system of military law, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, that was supposed to look a bit more like civilian justice. And then the UCMJ was revised over time, and in 1968, members of the armed forces got the right to be represented by lawyers. So you have now in the military due process rights, the right to know all of the charges against you before your trial, the right to be represented by a lawyer, and on and on and on.
And before it was not that way.
Before you could be dead in 20 minutes.
Wow. Okay.
There was an African American. During the Civil War, the Army created all black regiments led by white officers, and there was an all black regiment in Florida. And a white woman in the neighborhood of their camp came and said she'd been raped by 2 black soldiers, and effectively the white battalion commander picked out a couple of men. She kind of couldn't identify them really, but she said, "Oh, okay, I'll take those 2," and he took them to the gallows, and they were hanged. Wow. Moments after the allegation, moments after the court-martial.
Wow!
As a way of appeasing the locals and saying, "Look, you said there was a rape. I've killed some people," and that kind of justice was pretty standard military justice,
right,
for a long time. But the UCMJ made radical changes, and it would have been much, much, much easier to try people over My Lai before the UCMJ.
Okay. And so, and that kind of gets a little bit into, because My Lai was, I say My Lai, it depends on the day, My Lai, tomato, but when the My Lai massacre happened, it did seem like they got that those that were tried got a fairer shake than what you just described. Is that inaccurate to think?
Well, only one person ended up being tried. Actually, I'm not sure if that's true. I think Ernest Medina, who was the captain commanding the company, might have been tried. I don't remember offhand, but if he was, he wasn't convicted.
Okay.
There's only one person convicted.
Okay.
Lieutenant William Calley was convicted.
Right.
And mostly people who were involved in My Lai weren't court-martialed and weren't put on trial. And that's part of what I would argue about court-martials, is that there's always been a political context for military trials, that the politics of the larger American society has always reached into who's put on trial and how trials are carried out.
Mm-hmm.
And, you heard the Ballad of the Green Berets.
Yes.
Not the ballad, the Ballad of My Lai, the Ballad of William Calley. I'll find it eventually. There was a song written after My Lai was reported on.
I remember that.
What happened at My Lai came out.
Yeah.
About the heroic William Calley standing up to our enemies in Vietnam. There was considerable public sentiment in America that William Calley was a hero. That what had happened at My Lai was taking the war to the enemy. And in that context, it became, I think, more difficult to have honest justice over what happened at My Lai. So only one person was ever convicted.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and the fact that it was an officer, I mean, given some of the history of American courts martial, I mean, for example, the 2 black guys that got hung during the Civil War within 10 minutes, when you go back to the formation of the country, the Revolutionary War, flogging and dueling and accused homosexuality. Was there or was there not 2 different justice systems, say for the officer and the gentleman, compared to the enlisted man?
There were in a lot of ways. There's still some truth to this. There's still different legal standards for handling cases involving officers and handling enlisted men, but it's radically different now. There were very much 2 different legal systems for officers and enlisted, and that was true in all the services. It was particularly true in the Navy and the Marine Corps. And the Navy of the early United States, there's a fantastic book. Everyone should read this book called Rocks and Shoals by a historian named James Valle, V-A-L-L-E. And if you're interested in this topic, it's a beautiful book, exhaustively researched. Talks a lot about the idea of early naval justice as what James Valle called a blind lottery. So the early American Navy officers were sort of regarded as something like an aristocratic class. They were men of honor. They were from highly respectable families. There were, naval officers who were the sons of naval officers, whose sons went on to become naval officers. It was a highly respectable family thing, and officers were very highly regarded. Enlisted men were the trash swept up off the docks. They were guys who didn't have other things to do. They were landless laborers in the early American Republic, which was a big deal. They were men who were regarded as dependent because they didn't have their own land. They didn't have their own family farms. They were thought of very, very poorly. They were men of vanishingly little social substance. So you took these men who were regarded as trash, and in the early Republic, in the 18th century and the early 19th century, there were multiracial crews sent out to sea for years. They did 2 and 3 years, 2 and 3 year tours where they would sail off to foreign ports and be out at sea away from the United States for a couple of years. And those men who were regarded as trash were commanded by men who were regarded as aristocrats, really the highest quality men of the country. And so, it was sort of a case where the officer class couldn't do wrong. And ships out at sea, the presumption was if something goes really wrong. Herman Melville was a sailor before he was a writer, and he described warships as a box of pears closely packed.
Okay.
If one pair goes bad, every pair goes bad.
Oy.
So the idea was, in early American naval justice, that these gentlemen at sea, thousands of miles out to sea with no one else to help them, with a few officers on board controlling 100 or more enlisted men, had to keep those enlisted men under extremely strict control. And the way they did that was, traditional naval punishments like putting a sailor on bread and water, but the big punishment in the early American Navy was flogging. Ugh. And the idea was that a man could be struck with the cat o' nine tails 12 times for an offense under the authority of the captain of a ship. And naval regulations said that if an offense was more serious and warranted more punishment, warranted more flogging than 12 blows with the cat o' nine tails, that a sailor had to be brought back to shore or brought into the fleet so that the commodore commanding the fleet could order a court-martial, that the captain of a ship couldn't order a man struck more than 12 times for an offense with a cat o' nine tails. And what captains did at sea is they said, okay, this sailor committed 5 different offenses, so we'll hold captain's mast for this one offense. I find you guilty. I sentence you to be lashed 12 times with a cat o' nine tails. We're adjourned. We now reconvene. I try you before captain's mast on the second charge, right? They would pretend they were having 5 separate hearings, find people guilty, order them to be sentenced 12 times for each offense, and say, well, I didn't order him to be struck 60 times or 48 times. I ordered him to be struck 12 times. I just did it 4 or 5 times. And then sailors would be flogged dozens of times at sea. And people knew this went on, but they didn't really object because gentlemen were commanding trash at sea in dangerous circumstances.
Was there a specific reason they chose the cat o' nine tails? Because that whip actually rips flesh off your body.
That's why it was chosen, yeah, because, and, it's important to understand military justice as exemplary justice. The point of flogging a man who's been disobedient, disrespectful, who's gotten drunk, which was strictly prohibited on a warship at sea, and so on, a man who's committed serious offenses, the point of ordering him flogged at sea is that all of the other men on the ship see him. For weeks afterward, they see his shirt covered in blood. They see him groaning. They see him struggling to walk. They see what happens to you if you're disrespectful to an officer in a ship. Mm-hmm. And they have the example in front of them to say, don't you do this too.
Right.
And that's why, for example, it was always the case that if a man was executed for desertion or for striking an officer or something like that, that it happened quickly. The point of military justice was everybody who sees or is, in the same unit, the same company, the same ship, whatever, everyone who can see the act of disobedience or disrespect can see that it gets you shot or gets you flogged instantly. And they understand, don't do this, it's dangerous.
Wow. And so I remember we talked a little bit, and you mentioned that it had stopped around 1840, 1850. Was that because of the abolitionists?
It was because of the abolitionists. And what happened is, a group of writers, and Richard Henry Dana was one, and Herman Melville was another, began writing about, these were sort of Boston gentlemen who had enlisted and gone out and served as ordinary sailors. Richard Henry Dana in the Merchant Marine, Henry Melville in both the Merchant Marine and the U.S. Navy. And they wrote about their experiences, and Richard Henry Dana, in his book 2 Years Before the Mast, said that the captain of his merchant ship had personally flogged one of his sailors who was white. And he said to him as he flogged him that he said, "You're a Negro now. I've made you a Negro." He said, "You see who you have over you. You have a Negro driver. You have a slave driver." So Richard Henry Dana says that at sea, white sailors became black. They became like slaves, and they were treated like slaves by their white officers, by their white commanders. And then Herman Melville wrote just absolutely one of the great books of American military history called White Jacket, about his experiences on a U.S. Navy warship. And he said that flogging was unmanning, that you send men out to fight wars for their country and then you attack and destroy their manhood. And he said that it was un-Republican, small r Republican, not befitting a republic.
Right. And
Herman Melville's book was...
I'm sorry, Melville was not an officer, correct?
He was not.
Okay.
They were both enlisted.
Okay.
So Herman Melville's book, White Jacket, was published in 1850. And 1850 was a moment where the country was, again, debating slavery, debating westward expansion, and the westward expansion of slavery. And slavery was very much at the center of national politics. So 1850, when White Jacket was published, anti-slavery advocates, drinking water, began passing out copies of White Jacket to members of Congress. And they said, look, here is an instance in which we compel labor through flogging, through whipping, through physical discipline. And we're a republic. Shouldn't we ask men for labor as men? Shouldn't we get labor through cooperation, through a sort of manly discourse, a Republican discourse?
Right.
So they compared Navy flogging to the whipping of slaves. And in 1850, Congress voted to ban flogging in the Navy, and the vote was sectional. Southern congressmen voted against the ban. Northern congressmen voted for it. Abolitionists favored the banning of flogging in the Navy because it was a comparison for them, because it was a way of saying, here's a way to treat a man, to treat a human being as something less than human.
Right. Well, and then kind of a concurrent topic, really quick. I mean, you mentioned earlier after the UCMJ got passed, and how basically civil jurisprudence bled into the American military system. You couldn't die in 20 minutes, for example. You did get due process. You did get a defense attorney. You did get to know all the charges that were being held against you. Would it be safe to say that the old military justice system kind of bled into American civil jurisprudence? I mean, think about it in terms of, and I'm sure this has always been this way, but it's been more pronounced in, like, say, the last 30 years, 40 years. But there seems to be a two-tiered system in American civil justice. Is that a bleed over from the old military system, or no?
No, I think they've developed in very separate ways and for very separate purposes. I think I think the thing that has happened is that military justice has moved closer to civilian justice. As civilian justice has become, I mean, I think we've gone through sort of waves in civilian justice that with cases like the Gideon decision, cases like the Miranda decision, the Gideon's trumpet decision, that the Supreme Court decided. I think civilian justice has become, or became for a long time, more reasonable, more effective, more fair. Not sure we're still going that way. But military justice for a long time went in the opposite direction. I think they traveled in opposite directions for a long time until the 20th century when they began moving on the same course.
Okay. Well, I mean, and then I don't...
Now,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
I have serious doubts about sort of the quality and fairness of the American civilian justice system now, especially the federal justice system. I think we've seen tremendous due process problems. We've seen tremendous problems with the judgment of federal prosecutors lately, but that's another topic.
Yeah, it is, and I don't want to get too into the weeds on that, but for example, Lloyd Blankfein gets to walk free. Meanwhile, some woman on welfare who makes $12 an hour in addition to the welfare is looking at fraud and fines and 6 months in jail or community service. And we didn't prosecute a single Wall Street banker, for example. And so I got to wonder if the old military system has not what's been bled into the current system. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about because you'd mentioned earlier about dueling and how that was a distinct point in the Articles of War. Is that right?
It was, and it was sort of an example of the way that social values, that the way people think about life outside of the military gets into the military. And I'll give you another example, but to sort of get into the topic of flogging, of dueling. This is an earlier case. In 1799, there was an officer named David Whitney in the Vermont militia. He was a major general of the Vermont militia. And this actually is an illustration of the way that sort of the military justice and the civilian justice system moved in different directions. Historians have written about the decline of wife-beating prosecutions in the early United States. In the early United States, after the Revolution, for several decades, it became less and less likely that if you beat your wife, you would be prosecuted in a civilian courtroom because of a developing idea of privacy, because of a developing idea that what happened in your home was sort of your own business. And if you didn't put it out in the street, it wasn't something for the courts to consider. So in the early American Republic, if a man beat his wife in his home, he became sort of safer and safer from being prosecuted in a civilian courtroom. David Whitney beat his wife, and he slept with friends' wives, and he did a bunch of other, pretty nasty things. And his neighbors rode him around town on a rail. They broke into his home, and they dragged him out into the street, and they shamed him in the street. In this thing called skimmington, a shaming parade.
Okay.
And then the officers who served under him in the Vermont militia asked the governor of the state to court-martial him for conduct unbecoming an officer. And they did, and he was successfully court-martialed, and he was stripped of his commission. He was removed from the Vermont militia as a major general, as division commander.
Wow.
Very high-ranking officer. He was thrown out of the military, the state military, for beating his wife and sleeping with a friend's wife. And I can give you, dozens of examples of that in the early American Republic that men said, I can't follow you as a military officer because of your sexual morality, because of your treatment of your family, because you drink too much, because your politics are stupid. Men wouldn't follow men they didn't respect. Sure. And they said before some of them were tried by court-martials, a whole regiment of the Connecticut militia during the War of 1812 lost all of its officers. All of the officers of Connecticut's 17th Infantry Regiment stopped showing up. And they said, our commander has appointed an officer, a staff officer in the regiment, who is a weird guy, who's eccentric, who babbles, who says strange things, and we're not going to obey him. It would ruin our honor, our respectability as men to obey someone like that. So there's this set of social values. There's this way men think of themselves as men that comes from outside the military that well into the 20th century influenced the way men behaved as soldiers. So during the Civil War, you've heard of the Code Duello? Mm-hmm. The Code of Dueling says that dueling only happens between gentlemen. If a gentleman insults a gentleman, they can duel. If some piece of shit insults a gentleman, they can't duel because only gentlemen duel. And the piece of shit who insulted the gentleman doesn't have the standing, the social standing to participate in a duel. So what you do if you're a gentleman and you're insulted by someone who's below you in social status is you cane him. You go beat him in public. You don't give him the honor of facing you with equal weapons on the field of honor.
So you just take a stick. Take a stick and beat the shit out of him.
You just take a stick and beat the shit out of him
Okay.
because that's all he's worth.
Right.
So there are all of these very elaborate rules about how you duel. If you're a gentleman, you've been insulted by another gentleman, you name a second who's also a gentleman to represent you in the matter. You give your second a written demand that the other gentleman retract and apologize for his insult. And your second goes to the gentleman, and he appoints a second. And if the other gentleman doesn't retract, your seconds meet together as seconds and settle on the rules of the duel. Where will they meet? What weapons will they use? How many paces? Da, 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 da. Then the gentlemen meet on the field of honor, and they follow the rules. They fight with swords if that's what the seconds agreed to, or they fight with pistols if the seconds agreed to that. So there are rules. The Articles of War forbade dueling. They said you can't duel, you can't serve as a second in a duel, you can't challenge another officer to a duel, and on and on and on. During the Civil War, the War Department, which was a predecessor to the Department of Defense that oversaw the Army, issued new regulations that said any form of fighting to the death is a duel. Any form of two soldiers challenging each other to fight to the death is a duel and should be punished under the sections of the Article of War that refer to dueling. And so commanders would bring charges against two privates who said, you son of a bitch, let's go outside and bring a weapon and let's fight. I'm going to kill you. They would charge them with dueling. And when those soldiers showed up in front of court-martials at the time, not anymore, but at the time, court-martials were only ever made up of officers. And officers, courts made up of a dozen officers would look at the duel and they would ignore the War Department regulations. The War Department told them, treat any form of fighting to the death or challenging to fight to the death as a duel. And the officers said, well, why are two privates in front of us charged with dueling? Privates aren't gentlemen. They can't duel. Not guilty. They would ask questions like, who did you choose as your second? And if the answer was, well, I didn't have a second, I just told them, you son of a bitch, let's go outside and shoot each other, they said, well, that's not a duel. And so court-martials were acquitting men of dueling, completely ignoring the explicit formal regulations that the War Department wrote. They had a set of social values, a set of social rules that they applied in a formal legal setting, and they totally ignored the formal legal rules that were supposed to govern their behavior.
Wow. And how did that evolve moving forward? Because clearly dueling fell out of fashion, by the early 1900s, I want to say, or maybe earlier, the 1880s?
Before. I mean, even during the Civil War, it was beginning to fall out of fashion.
Right. Okay. So earlier, how did they reconcile that? Did they care? Did it become like a blue law that nobody paid attention to anymore?
It became a law that stopped mattering.
Right.
Because people stopped doing it. There's a novel called Effie Briest about a gentleman in Europe as Europe is becoming modern and men stop dueling, and he sort of still believes in dueling, and it's the novel depicts him as an anachronism in a modern age.
Okay.
And there's a book by a historian named Lorian Foote called The Gentleman and the Roughs, about dueling in the Civil War, and she finds a case where an officer was insulted by another officer, and so he walked into their headquarters and he challenged the other man to a duel, a gentleman challenging another gentleman, and the other gentleman went and filed charges against him. So you had a guy who thought that the way that gentlemen solved their conflicts was they met on the field of honor. And you had another guy who was also an officer, was also a gentleman, who said, well, you're an idiot. It's not like that anymore. And when he was challenged to a duel, he went and reported the challenge to his commander and said, I'd like to see this handled in court. So it had already begun breaking down socially.
Okay.
But there was this moment when the courts didn't know what to do. And there are a lot of these moments. There are a lot of moments where military courts don't know what to do. And sort of the crisis of homosexuality during the Cold War is one of the other big examples.
Right. Can you go into that for a little bit?
So there's a book by a historian named David Johnson. It's called The Lavender Scare. And it's about this sort of panic for order that happened during the Cold War, that in the civilian side of the federal government, people became concerned about, understandably became concerned about the Cold War, the conflict with the Soviet Union, and became about Soviet infiltration, Soviet spies, Soviet subversion in the American government, and began to equate that with sexual threats, with sexual disorder, and believed that homosexuality and communism were discursively linked. That if you were gay, you were subversive, and if you were subversive, you were probably a communist. And there was an associated threat that if you were a gay man, particularly in the 1950s in Washington, D.C., if you were caught by Soviet spies, if you were caught and they had evidence that you were gay, particularly say you were a married man, married to a woman, and you were caught having an affair with another man, that they had blackmail material on you and could say, why don't you bring us some information from your work in the Army or the State Department? So, I really encourage everyone to look this up and read it. There's an executive order that Dwight Eisenhower issued, Executive Order 10450. 10450. And in 10450, Executive Order 10450, Dwight Eisenhower banned from federal employment whole categories of people he defined as subversives.
Sure.
And among them were communists and perverts. He said, if you're
a pervert's a big description, though.
If you're a communist or a pervert, you can't serve in the federal government in civilian positions. So there was during the Cold War, there was a security apparatus that existed to investigate charges of sexual perversion among federal employees. And they did things like, if someone was accused, if they got an anonymous tip that so-and-so in the State Department is a lesbian, they went in, searched her home, found her address book, and went around and asked all her friends why they were associating with a known homosexual. And if you were a federal employee and your name was in the address book of someone who the security apparatus caught as a known homosexual, then security investigators showed up and asked you, why are you associating with a known homosexual? Is there something we should know about you?
Wow.
So it became this witch hunt, and careers were destroyed, lives were destroyed. And security investigators would do things like go around your neighborhood and say, hey, we hear Bob is a homosexual. Have you ever seen him doing anything like that? And sort of the word was spread about people all through their hometown, all through wherever they lived or worked. So there's a parallel thing that happened in the military where for a long time in the military, the military didn't want to talk about sexuality. And there's a famous case in the 19th century where an army officer serving on the frontier saw another army officer having sex with his own daughter. And he reported it. He reported it to the major general who commanded their division. And that major general put that officer on trial. He put the officer who reported the offense on trial for bringing the army into disrepute. Basically, he said, like, why the fuck would you say that out loud? If you saw something like that, nobody needs to know it. Nobody needs to know that shit like that happens in the army. Go away and be quiet. They put him on trial for bringing the army into disrepute. There's a book called Ungentlemanly Acts that's about this case. Wow. And Herman Melville talks about when sailors in the 19th century Navy would try to report acts of sodomy and acts of attempted male-on-male rape below decks. They would walk up to an officer and start describing what had happened, and officers would turn and walk away.
Wow.
James Val in Rocks and Shoals says that when you look at records of early Navy court-martials for sodomy, court-martials would start taking testimony from witnesses. Mm-hmm. And the moment witnesses started to say, well, I saw this one sailor on top of this other sailor, and I saw his penis, they would say, we're adjourned.
Right.
We're done.
Nothing to see here.
And the next day, the offender, they would find him not guilty, or they would adjourn without reaching a verdict. They would say, we're not talking about this. We're not taking this testimony. And the next day, the offender would very quietly leave the fleet. But they wouldn't hear those cases, and there is a long, deep history in the United States military of not wanting to talk about sexual offenses. But then suddenly, in the Cold War, there is a mania for sex charges. And
right.
And the Army and the Navy began very carefully policing sexual behavior.
Well, linked to communism. I mean, I remember the term pinko when I was a kid, and pinko was like a dual meaning. You were a commie and a homosexual.
Linked
if they called you a pink,
exactly.
If they called you a pinko, it was like that was a double. That was like a double curse on you. But real quick, we're running out of time here. I wanted to ask you a couple things really fast because again. And if I seem too hung up on this, it's just my own personal thing, but I'll give you an example. So, for example, in 2011, Barack Obama signs the NDAA, mm-hmm. which basically guts habeas corpus for American citizens. Mm-hmm. And every time I bring that up, folks like to say, well, actually Bush did that. Well, Bush did that in 2005 for enemy combatants, mm-hmm. not for American citizens. And I'm only thinking that he did that to circumvent any issues concerning, traditional prisoners of war because we were dealing with quote unquote terrorism. So did Bush's 2005 enemy combatant habeas corpus issue, did that lay the groundwork for Obama to sign the NDAA, which, he signed on New Year's Eve. So that should tell you how cool he was about it.
I don't know how to answer that. I don't know what to say about why Barack Obama did what he did, but what I would say about that topic and about the way we've handled captured enemy combatants is that it's an example of America not knowing what to do, and it's an example of America kicking the can down the road. We have had hundreds of detainees at Guantanamo. We have military commissions operating at Guantanamo, and 8 of those detainees have been tried all the way to a verdict and a sentence. We've been sort of running this show of having military commissions that mostly don't reach conclusions. We've had Mohammed Atta, what the fuck is his name? Since 2001. Didn't we capture him in October of 2001?
He was one of the first guys we captured. And not Mohammed Atta. He was one of the guys who died in the planes. But Mohammed Sheikh God damn it. It hit me a second too, but continue. I'm sorry.
Mohammed Sheikh, God damn it. Let's go with that. And there was this debate in the Obama administration about putting him on trial in a civilian courtroom. They were going to put him on trial in a civilian courtroom in New York. And Republicans objected. And so they put him on trial nowhere. Right? He's never been tried by military commission. Now, during World War II, the Germans put a group of English-speaking German citizens who had lived in America ashore in Florida and New York on 2 different submarines to go into the U.S. and sabotage war production. They washed up on the beach with duffel bags full of explosives. And they were all caught really quickly, in part because one of them got cold feet and called the FBI. And FDR convened a military commission and put them on trial before a military commission. And 6 of them, they were all convicted, but the 2 who cooperated their lives were spared. The other 6 were killed. The other 6 were executed in the electric chair in Washington, D.C. The trial took a few weeks, and the sentence was carried out immediately afterwards. So throughout American history, when we've captured enemy combatants and tried them for war crimes, for spying, for sabotage, it's been, one of those 10-minute processes. Oh, we caught you with a bag full of explosives in New York, and you'd be dead, in a month or 2. Suddenly we find that we have enemy combatants, we have military commissions to try them, but we can't quite bring ourselves to do it. We can't quite bring ourselves to finish the process. And I think it's an example of politicians endlessly kicking the can down the road because we don't want to figure it out. We don't want to have the debate. It's a difficult debate. What do we do with people who we've caught trying to kill Americans?
But isn't that the nature of war? I mean, prisoners of war are people that we caught trying to kill Americans. You catch a German in World War II.
Honestly,
right?
My answer would be that it's not that fucking hard, but for some reason we've decided to find it hard. And so we can't bring ourselves to bring these cases to a close. We can't bring ourselves to have a process that moves in a decisive way.
The guy's name was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. That was the guy.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
That's the guy.
Forevermore be known as Mohammed Sheikh, goddammit. I think it's a better name for him.
Mohammed Sheikh, goddammit. I don't mean to tell you from Philadelphia. But see,
I'm pretty sure he's not Indian.
Yeah, he's Pakistani, which is basically a bunch of pissed off Muslim Indians who went ahead and started their own country. But this is kind of like my where I think it bleeds in. For example, kicking the can down the road. We did enemy combatants instead of prisoners of war. We don't want really a conclusion to it, and maybe in a more sinister way because it creates endless war. Yeah. But this is where I get to the NDAA, for example, because between Patriot Acts 1 and 2 and the NDAA, we've now made legal everything that Nixon got busted for. Because now, I mean, we're gutting habeas corpus for the American citizen. So you can arrest journalists. You can take a woman you could take somebody like Amy Goodman, who's all of 5 feet tall, 95 pounds wet, and say that she's inciting a riot while she's being a journalist, and arrest her. And if she had no notoriety, you could just keep her indefinitely. I mean, because now we don't have that. We don't have that anymore. So
I don't think we're making a practice of arresting journalists yet. And in fact, I think there's a very deep history in America of doing exactly that.
Woodrow Wilson did it.
Woodrow Wilson did it. John Adams did it. Yep. It happened during the Civil War that reporters who covered the military on both sides were arrested for spying. So I think there's a very deep history in America of arresting and attacking journalists that we've mostly turned away from. I think we're headed in a better direction there.
Do you really believe that?
I really do.
So I legally, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think that journalists mostly are in much less peril at this moment than they've been in most of American history.
Because they're not talking about anything. They're Rachel Maddow talking about Russia. You're safe as a fucking Buddhist. You're safe as a Hindu cow.
Wouldn't disagree with that at all. I would say one thing, which is that Glenn Greenwald, who I think lives in Brazil now.
Yeah, but he works for The Guardian, though.
And works for The Intercept.
Right, I'm sorry. He couldn't work for an American paper or a news entity at all.
Yeah. He's the canary in the coal mine if he's ever arrested or anything like that. He's a journalist who's still really a journalist.
Right.
And so far appears to be safe. I want to say one thing, though. I want to circle back to something you said, which is about the difference between enemy combatants and prisoners of war.
Okay.
I think that distinction actually matters and actually makes sense. And I don't take it as a negative sign that we're using that distinction, because prisoners of war have always been people who fight in a declared conflict for a government in uniform. If you're a German soldier fighting against the United States and you're captured in World War II in a declared war, you are a prisoner of war and you have rights under the Geneva Convention, which is negotiated between states. People who are not state actors, this is one of the great conflicts, one of the great controversies of 21st century American military justice. We all saw this coming, I think, 20 years ago, that the rise of groups like Al-Qaeda at the time and ISIS now, these are not people who fight for a state. These are not people who fight in a declared war. These are not people who fight in conflict between states. So how do you treat a non-state actor? And something like the Geneva Convention was negotiated between states. So I think it's fair and it's reasonable to say that it doesn't apply to non-state actors.
Well, I would agree with that.
People who aren't captured in uniform and people who are captured as insurgents, who are captured not fighting for an organized force. So I think there's a basis in reality for that distinction.
But yeah, I agree with you 100% on that assessment. But doesn't that speak to the shallowness of the American electorate, our attention span, that we can have a sitting president declare a war on an idea? Because the reason why they're enemy combatants is because we declared war on terror. Declared the war on poverty and the war on drugs. Bang up job so far. Big whiz-bang job there. We declared war on an idea. You can't get an idea. Germany, we know where it is. They got uniforms. They got a return address, right? We have declared war on an idea. You could even go after the Palestinian Authority without a country called Palestine, because they're still like just a territory. They're an occupied territory. They're not a country. But you have more validity going after the Palestinian Authority than you do going after ISIS or Al Qaeda or Al-Aqsa's Martyr Brigade or any of these other guys that are just an idea. Yeah. So doesn't that kind of speak to just the stupidity of the electorate, where 82% of this country still believes in angels, by the way, right? And so we declare war on an idea, and that sounds like a good thing to do. And now we're, how many trillions of $15 trillion in between the two wars that Bush got us into, the six more that Obama got us into and left us with. I mean, so I agree with you at 100% of what you just said, because they are not a formal government. Yeah. However, what the hell are we doing there?
So one of the great debates in the military, this is something people in the military talk about. There's a colonel named Gian Gentile, who I haven't looked at this for a while, but the last I looked, he was teaching at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, have written about the problem of winning wars when you haven't named your enemy. When you're, as you say, fighting against an idea, when you have an amorphous idea of who you're fighting for and what you intend to achieve by fighting. And there's a great debate inside the American military about why, for example, we've been in Afghanistan for 16 years with no end in sight. And defeating, Japan and Italy and Germany took 4 years after the United States entered the war. I think that's less a justice issue and more sort of an issue of grand strategy. But I wouldn't question the idea that we don't really know what to do with the military anymore. We don't really know what this thing is for and how it's supposed to work. And we have not named our enemies in a specific way, in a way that identifies how we mean to beat them and how the war ends. The idea of war is peace. The idea of war is that someone attacks you, that someone threatens to attack you, that you face the threat of violence, so you fucking crush them so you can have peace again. And when we have wars that go on forever, that we can't resolve, when we have people who are enemy combatants that we hold forever, that we can't resolve their cases, then yes, it suggests that we aren't thinking about what a military is for, and we aren't thinking about who our enemies are and how we mean to defeat them and how we mean to restore peace. And that becomes, I think, very dangerous over time, both as a matter of strategy, as a matter of our power, because our power declines as we don't know how to use it, and as a matter of justice. During World War I, a journalist said that war is the health of the state. War is the health of the state. I think it's a great idea that as long as you're at war, it becomes easier for government to use emergency measures. Well, we couldn't afford to give you a trial because we're at war and we can't be destroyed. The longer we remain notionally at war, the longer we can't restore peace, the longer we're threatened by what has been called the jurisprudence of emergency. So yeah, I think there's a lot to what you're saying, that it's not all a justice issue, but yes, we should know who we're fighting and we should know what the purpose of war is.
Oh man, well listen, I'm now just looking at the clock and we're right just about out of time. That went by really quick. I really want to thank you for coming on, and I definitely want to have you back on again to talk about other similar and sundry topics, because American history is a big subject, and there's going to be a lot of things that you are more than qualified to talk about. Folks, our guest today has been Chris Bray. New book coming out this summer, U.S. Naval Institute on Military Justice. Court Martial is out, has been out for a little bit. You can still get that on Amazon or at your local bookstore. If this stuff makes you uncomfortable, guys, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.